thanks very much for coming. I'm going to sort of kick things off. This is just a little introduction to us, Armando and Fergus. But thank you so much for the introduction. So what we're going to talk about today is a little bit around some generative AI. It's a super hot topic at the moment, really at the forefront of our minds. And then have a little look about how some of the open source projects are actually driving innovation in this area. And then Armando's going to speak to you about synthetic data in practice and dealing with privacy. So really, another really hot topic we've just had a great session about as well. So I'd like to start with generating text, code, and images. So really using AI, all of the innovation to generate new content. You'll be familiar with some of the technologies and the products that I'm about to share with you. So I'll go through this slowly, but you may be very familiar with things like ChatGPT in the news, GPT-3. You may also be familiar with GitHub Copilot, and then also image rendering like Midjourney, Stable Diffusion, technologies like DALL-E. This is a really rapidly expanding space in generative AI. So what I've done here is in red boxes, I've put sort of products and paid for closed source projects. And in green, I've put open source alternatives. And I'll speak a little bit about those open source projects and how innovation is being driven through the open source and through what is, quite frankly, quite astounding mass participation from our communities, because this is really exciting technology that a lot of people, and some of whom are quite new to coding technology, are really interested in using, and we'll explore a little bit about why that is. So I put the tagline, where there's a project, there's an OS alternative. It's kind of, in these two examples, it's interesting because where we have paid for projects, we have open source, but also there's examples like Stable Diffusion, where actually Stable Diffusion, which I'll show you more about, was ahead of the game in the open source, and people have been making and developing products from that technology and kind of profiting off the back of it, which is interesting. So the most obvious one and the one that's been the biggest in the news and the media is OpenAI. But despite the name, not so open. They're not actually open sourced. You can't get access to the model itself and the data. It's behind a paywall. You can pay to use the API. They're open in the sense that they're open about what they're doing and how they're doing it, not necessarily in the code that runs it. So a lot of great products that are coming out from GPT-3. The most notable in the media is obviously ChatGPT, which hopefully you've all tried out. If you haven't, I'd encourage you to wait in their queue and give it a go. Also, tools like GitHub Copilot, which is a generative text-based trained on a codex with GPT-3, and is really amazing at generating code snippets, helping you learn to program, helping you to complete tasks faster. We'll talk a little bit about the ethics and some of the problems that come with that. I just wanted to share with you, though, that we are starting to see open source projects in these areas. But the problem, especially with text generation and image generation specifically, is that there's so much data that needs to go into this. All of these have done huge trawls of the internet to scrape data, and that's where the kind of value is in these models, and that's where the difficulty with being open and sharing is, because that's kind of the secret sauce. There is a project called Facebook OPT, which is the O is for open, pre-trade transformer, that you can have a look at. And again, they're open with where their data sets come from, and you can use the model in a more open way, but not quite as much as GPT-3. So what are we actually talking about? I'd like to use images as an example because I think it makes for a more interesting presentation. This is an example from Stable Diffusion. I've just put this here to remind myself, but actually the data subset was trawled from a huge internet crawl that was done for image and text pairs to chain these. So the setup I've given it is a conference room with an audience set up in London with a super cool presentation, because that's where we are, right? So this is Stable Diffusion, completely open source. You can find their GitHub. These will be uploaded afterwards, so you can find all these links if you'd like to. You can go and find their models and actually play around with them. run them on your own hardware, run them on your own GPUs, which is great. Some of the competitors on other products, like what's it called? I can't even remember. I put it on the slide there. Midjourney, that's the one. Products like Midjourney, you have no control over where those are running or the interface that you're using. They don't have an API. Whereas Stable Diffusion, you can actually run on your own hardware, which is really interesting. You can see, so this is a completely generated image from this service. So you can see the general theme's pretty good. We can see some interesting artifacts, like in the chairs look a bit strange. People's faces, even though they're looking from the back, are a bit odd. There's just something a little bit unusual about it. It doesn't deal very well with text, things like that, for example. The paid-for version with exactly the same prompt from Midjourney has given us this. I hope you'll agree it's like a lot smoother. It's more nicely rendered. And it's kind of understood a little bit of the context better. There are some rumors that Midjourney, this service, is actually trained off of Stable Diffusion. So may have actually taken the kind of base algorithms from Stable Diffusion and added to them to improve the product. And that's what people are paying for. But this is a really popular product with all sorts of people just getting into generative AI, or people looking to generate new ideas, or art and graphics for stories, for games, lots and lots of different areas that this is being used in, and people are quite willing to pay the $10 a month price tag for it. Word of warning, some of you may be aware, or may have seen that the Stable Diffusion is actually being sued by Getty Images. Obviously, generative AI is a huge problem for companies like Getty Images, which rely on having enough photo and content to relate to the content that you want to buy and pay for. But we can see here in this example that wherever the data's come from to train this algorithm, we can actually see artifacts of Getty image watermarks in. So Getty Images are fairly confident that it's been trained at least on not that open data. So there's a huge warning which runs with the session previously, which is we need to be sure of where the data in these projects is coming from, and we need to be really sure that we can trust this before we go ahead and use this in like commercial applications. But still a really interesting technology nonetheless. This is the image. This is the image example. There's lots of other examples, especially with GitHub Copilot and GPT-3, where similar-ish things are happening with text. It's just a little bit harder to trace, because to me that's fairly obviously a Getty Images logo. So what I want to try and do is do a live demo. So I'd like to take just a few suggestions from anything that people would like to see in Stable Diffusion. You can try this at home as well. You can just go to stablediffusionweb.com, or you can go to the GitHub, download the models, and run it on your own hardware. Does anybody have any random word suggestions? Dog, right, that's a good one. Anything else? Yeah. Football? Cowboys. Okay. Okay, dog, a cowboy dog playing football. Maybe we'll go with that. Jimmy Wales? So this is running on some like an example hardware. There we go. So some interesting results. We might want to try messing around with the prompts. But we've definitely got some footballs. We've definitely got some cowboys. Jimmy Wales, maybe not so much. Any other suggestions? We'll do another quick one. Tom Daley? It's not very good with people, but we'll try. Tom Daley. And there was something about a whale. Knitting. He does knit. Yeah. We could probably Google that and find a real image. Let's see if it knows who Tom Daley is. Yeah, it's pretty creepy, but it's there's some knitting going on there. There's some knitting going on there. It kind of knows what he should look like. So, you can spend hours having some good fun with that. So what are some applications and where is some of the innovation coming from? This is a project completely open source called Dream Textures, where they've actually taken the Stable Diffusion model and applied it as a Blender plugin. So these are just some 3D shapes in Blender, which are actually the image that's being generated is wrapping straight around that model. So we've gone from having a plain blank 3D model to actually a textured 3D model really, really quickly. I've just got a live video of showing you how that actually works in practice. So this runs on your own GPU, and in Blender you can just type whatever you want. So I've taken just a cuboid shape and said I want it to be a cereal box, and using the same Stable Diffusion models, but just in a slightly different way that's been tweaked by members of the open source community, we get to a point where we can render that 3D cereal box. This is just one example of a project that's working off the back of another open source project to do something really cool and apply that technology. Okay. It is being used in real-world products as well. So this is an example from High on Life, where they've actually used some generative AI art in the posters. For this particular game, the uncanny valley, if you like, of those slightly odd things that happen in the images worked quite well for this particular game. But as we're getting better at this, and as the community is developing them, the results are much better. Another example is Pointy. So this is from OpenAI. This is an open source project from OpenAI, where they're taking the same algorithms, but instead of outputting images, flat images, we're actually outputting 3D point clouds. So we can get, with the same text classifiers and things, we can actually get to 3D objects and 3D models. A really cool open source project that I'd encourage you to look at. And this is only a few weeks old, so really interesting stuff. So what's next and what's the goal? The goal really, or an interesting point for me would be, can we get to a point where we can actually generate new solutions or new products that are trained on completely synthetic data? So if I model something in Blender and make up a cereal box, can I then actually use that in something useful? There's lots of applications around gaming, there's lots of applications around metaverse, but actually are there important applications in AI, for example? This is a really interesting GitHub project from Unity Technologies, who do the game engine for Unity. This isn't generated content, but they're using this idea of actually you can use a game engine to render lots and lots of different images to train a computer vision model. So if you've got lots of stock keeping units, lots of different brands, you can actually train a system to recognize each individual brand without ever seeing a real product or a real photo of a product. So we can actually generate new, useful AI models from data that never really existed. In this case, arguably, the data did exist because there's branding, there's boxes. But you can imagine a lot of the background work we could do with tools like Stable Diffusion, and in exactly the same way we can do that with text, with GPT-3, OpenAI, and other technologies that are available. So with that, I'd like to hand over to Armando, who's going to talk about synthetic data uses in business. Oops.
Thank you. Okay, so yeah, it was a very good introduction. From my side, my experience is pretty much around working with synthetic data for organizations, places where we want to keep the data private, but at the same time we want to do some machine learning, some analysis.
I'm really sorry, Armando. I've got stuck with your microphone.
I'm sorry. Yeah, here.
You got it?
Okay, sorry for that. It's okay now? It's okay now? Yeah, okay, sorry. So I was just saying that my experience is pretty much around use of synthetic data in large organizations where for some reasons they want to do analytics, they want to do machine learning on top of the data, but some of this data, like in banks or insurance, is private, so it's very delicate to move it around, so it's a very difficult situation. So for these cases, what normally these companies use is anonymization, but anonymization, basically what they do is, like, instead of telling which client live in a specific street, a specific address, they probably give it like a region, so they pretty much broaden the categories where they belong to, which is fine for some purpose, but to do machine learning, this data is pretty much useless. So we need to have some details that anonymization do not deserve. At the same time, anonymization is not completely safe. There have been some papers showing that you can do some leakage attack on this anonymized data. So it's a bit less value data and still not safe. So this is being used for speed up innovation. So sometimes organizations want to share data internally, not necessarily externally. They want to share with the internal teams, but still they can take in the bank. It takes 6 months or a year to do for all of these procurement steps necessary to liberate and give access to the data because it's very sensitive data. Also, it's been has been pointed just in the last slide of the previous presentation. So it's synthetic data is being more and more used to do machine learning. So it comes to a point where basically we don't need reality anymore. We just can play in this fictitious synthetic environment because they are becoming so good that it's not necessarily, we don't need necessarily to have access to the reality anymore. So yeah, there's been some cases where leakage attacks and disclosure information gets very huge implications in terms of the business and reputation of the business. So it's really, really key to have this data as safe as possible. So there are many techniques to generate this data. Data we're talking about is like traditional relational database data, not the images or text which has been mentioned. That is for unstructured. As you call unstructured. These data organizations have this pretty much structure. You can fit it in the CSV, in the Excel spreadsheet, or in the database. So this kind of data. So there are several techniques to generate synthetic versions of this data, like city guns, doppelgangs, differential privacy, Wasserstein guns. There's some open source project like SynPop from AZ, Synthetic Data Vault, that works on not only tabular data, also sequential data and multi-table data, and also the diffusion-based models. Some of them are open source as well. So in terms of the uses for the synthetic data, so it can be used for testing, for analytics, for cloud deployment when the companies want to test the capabilities in the cloud. They don't want to test it in the real data, so they create synthetic data, which is fine. For provisioning and for innovation, probably it's the most important use case to provide innovation, mostly internally, but also externally. So really the benefits of this is that we get all the value without having compromising any of the privacy side. And the nice thing about this is that we have a mathematical methods that can guarantee some privacy measures. So if the client wants to really, really be sure the data is private, we have a technique called differential privacy, and we give we create synthetic data with different differential privacy levels. Of course, if you want to make the data more private, probably you get less value because it gets more fuzzy, you get less details in it. But we have a mathematical guarantee that the data, it's not possible to de-anonymize. Okay, so it's been some uses in for instance, to use of the synthetic data to solve problems like biases and fairness in the AI. It's very well known that AI models, they reinforce the bias. So in this case, for instance, this is for mostly AI, one of the players in the field of synthetic data. So if we train a model to a very classical data set called the adult data set, we want to predict the income, what are the percentage of population who has an income above $50,000. The original population is pretty much male bias, so we have a percentage of males much higher than females. Well, that reflects the reality, it's true, but if you train a machine learning on that, even if this is like maybe not a very important factor, but the fact that you have in the population more males than females, the machine will probably identify the gender to be an indicator of income. So we have female, we have more, you are less likely to have an income above 50K. Okay, so it's just this confounding factor becomes like an explainable factor. To avoid this situation, what we can do with synthetic data, we generally we synthetically create more females to get the population more balanced. Okay, so you increase that value from 10% to the same level of 30%, synthetic generated cases. It will not compromise the accuracy of the model, so that it not destroy. If gender is important, it still be there, but at least it's not biased. So the model will not become biased because you see more situations in one case than the other. It is very important use case for synthetic data. Another important case, as just been mentioned, is use of synthetic data to really get better accuracy of models in cases where it's very difficult to get data, like in medical images. Some of these models, as you will know, perform very well, but they need lots of data, like thousands or millions of images of cases to really perform well. And in medical, in many cases, in the medical area, we don't have that many images. So synthetic data can really help. I remember 4 or 5 years ago, I played with a technique called cycle guns. That was very cool. So we are trying to identify cancer cells in the lung. We didn't have enough images. What I did is I transformed healthy tissues with cancer tissues. So I artificially, it's something that's not very desirable. Yeah, we are not finished in that. So that's a very important use case. The landscape is very crowded at the moment, and many players in synthetic data. Some of them are work on structured data, others more on structured images, and even sound, text. We already mentioned that. So it's some of these projects are open source, others not so much. Yeah, so this is some examples. We already mentioned this. Yeah, pretty much it. Thank you very much. We have a Q&A now.
Yeah. So yeah, we'd be happy to take some questions if anybody has any. Yeah, there's one here.
Hello? Oh, yeah. You mentioned how the synthetic data, can be used to bulk up the data to train things like medical records, but if you're making the synthetic data from existing data, which is generally quite biased towards certain demographics where you're able to gather that medical data, how do you ensure that bias is not reinforced?
Well, what I refer to the bias is just the fact that you see a category, like in this case, gender, male or female, that you see more often one than the other, that by itself makes the model to be biased toward the majority, because you just see more examples of that. So if you see out of 1,000 individuals, you see 99% of them are male, getting this high income. So we will just statistically, we will assume that the fact that you are a male, you get more income than a female, okay? So you're right. I mean, you cannot artificially generate situations that don't exist. So what these methods does, they look at the few minority class, okay? They look at these cases, and they artificially create more fictitious cases, okay? But if, for instance, if the data set never was exposed, like different countries, or will not be able to do that. So it's limited. I agree with you. This capability is limited. It's just we augment the minority class, but to make sure at least this is somehow diluted. Okay, it's not perfect. I'm not saying that. It's because the machine cannot imagine what will be like individuals, like in situations completely different from it was exposed. So it's not a final solution, like a complete solution, but it's like a step towards solving this bias issue. Yeah.
Actually, for Fergus, well, for both of you, generative AI is really fascinating, and it's just mind-blowing the things that it can do. But what I worry about is like what it's trained on is essentially the intellectual property of the human race, right? And like, there's no reason for us to continue generating ourselves that human intellectual property. So what is the point of human beings anymore?
Well, I think it's sort of a double-edged sword, isn't it? Because it's generating more content for human beings. So I think the fact that we're in that uncanny valley still is really interesting, because it kind of knows what Tom Daley looks like, but it can't replicate his face. It kind of knows what a dog playing football should look like, but it doesn't know if there's one or two balls. So it's sort of a double-edged sword in that it's only ever going to be as good as the vast amount of data that goes into it. So for me, it's more like about making sure we're using the outputs for the right things. So yeah, we can use them for prototyping, we can use them for like background images and things, but it shouldn't be replacing art, it shouldn't be replacing anything that actually requires some creativity. I think a lot of people get very quickly, a lot of artists quite rightly get very quickly very defensive of generative AI art, because it is almost as if you've just sort of cut up 1,000 other artists' work and stuck it back together. It's like, but I prefer to think of it as a separate category. So generative AI isn't art and it isn't necessarily artistic. It's interesting and cool to look at. We'll see lots of people do their Facebook profile pictures as generative AI art, but ultimately I don't think it's going to like replace, it's just going to augment what's currently going on. I think another really interesting thing is that there's, I can't remember the exact number, I'm afraid, but there was a survey done of LinkedIn where people are actually starting to say that their job or their skills is prompt writer. So there's a new skill and there's a new job opportunity around, hi, I'm a person who knows how to write the prompt to go into a generative AI to get a good result, which is just fascinating and very bizarre. But yeah, hopefully humans are still interesting and useful.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's just what these machines, I think in the end, was algorithms make us think is like, what is to be human? What we have special? Because they are hitting our lunch every day. Like we are not that much in math. It's long ago. We're not that good in games. We're not that good in media areas. Now is in something we take very precious. It's hard. Something creative and get a bit scary. I get a bit scary, but I think we need to get used to this idea. And I think this is, as Fergus said, is augmenting us. So it's exploring. I've playing around ChatGPT, and I don't stop to be amazed by how cool it is, especially in poetry and things like completely. I wrote a love poem in Donald Trump style, and it was just mind-blowing. It got completely, I mean, you have to try it at home. It's just mind-blowing. You got the little things just very, very good. So, but I see like these machines allow us to create a very advanced playground where you can get hints, ideas, because that's what creativity is like. And sometimes being challenged, like I say, I disagree and get some memory. There's a very cool app, if you want to try it, it's called Character AI, where you can pretend to talk with Nietzsche or Freud or Wittgenstein, and it's really cool. Or sometimes your loved one, if you have enough data, and it's really cool. And it just, I think it augments your skills, your imagination. It makes you more creative in the end. Yeah. No worries.
I think again, we could talk forever on this topic, but I'd like everyone to please put their hands together to thank Armando and Fergus.